Probably the most significant change for Malifaux 4th edition is that we are all going to need to redesign our gaming tables. What's up everybody, Jeff here, and Malifaux 4th edition is very exciting. There's a lot of new interesting changes going on with the game, but I think maybe the most significant change is going to have to do with the terrain. Now, right off the bat, let me just say that all of the deployment zones are going to be the same. So if you have any aligned mats that show deployment zones for Malifaux 3rd edition, they are going to carry right over to 4th. Thankfully, we don't have to go replace all of our mats. But the terrain on the table is not the same story because there's a couple of significant changes in the rules that are going to mean that we're going to want a lot more terrain available in our games of Malifaux 4th edition. If you played a lot of 3rd edition, then you know that the tables that were typically played on in Malifaux 3rd edition usually comprised of some forests, some buildings with blocking terrain, some scatter, boxes, things like that, but not a whole lot of verticality. I've actually myself designed a handful of tables that had some like raised pathways and buildings that you could climb up on top of, but in 3rd edition the rules didn't really allow you to take advantage of those things super well. The movement rules meant that those were kind of just hindrances, and it was pretty difficult unless you had some particular special rules like flight to get on top of any of those buildings or to maneuver around them. So what that meant was usually if you put a raised section in a board, most players would just kind of stay away from it or treat it like a big piece of blocking terrain. There wasn't a ton of interactability there, and there wasn't a lot of people who were taking advantage of those things, again, except for if you had something like Fly or Incorporeal, and you could use it to sort of back away from your opponent when they couldn't follow up and chase you. Now, there's two things that I think are going to be huge in 4th edition that are really going to redefine the way that we design these tables. The first thing is there are a bunch of new rules that have to do with the way your models move around that are going to mean that you can really take advantage of a higher density of terrain as well as terrain that is more vertical. First of all, we have the scaling ability, and what this does is it basically allows you to take a walk action, and at the end of the walk action, if you're standing in base contact with climbable terrain, you just zip right to the top of it or to the bottom of it if you're already on top. And this means that it's so much easier to maneuver around and get to different places faster and not have to just treat the taller pieces of terrain like giant pieces of blocking. Now, this rule definitely sounds a little bit oversimplified in my opinion, but in the handful of games that I've played, it actually felt really good because it meant that you could run across an open battlefield and then jump on top of a building or scale a set of rocks. And in any case, be pretty maneuverable, and I think that it feels very flexible, and it also feels a little bit more realistic in the sense that these characters should be trained in battlefield tactics. They should be running around very dynamically and trying to jump into cover and doing things and not just kind of walking slowly over to the side of a building and then standing next to it and then waiting till the next turn to climb up on top. Another thing that is changing is you're going to have the ability to jump. And basically the way that this rule works is if you have enough horizontal movement available to reach across a gap and get to the other side, then you're able to just go across, as long as it's not more than an inch lower than the place that you start. So what this means is if there is, let's say, a broken building with a 2-inch gap in between, you can run right across it like the gap wasn't there. Or more significantly, if you're on top of some buildings in, let's say, a city like Malifaux, you can run across the roofs and jump to the next one and keep going. It's going to feel a little bit more like an Assassin's Creed game, or if you've ever played Carnivale, which is a game by TT Combat, they have a really interesting and dynamic movement system that allows you to really take advantage of a lot of the terrain and the verticality on the boards. And Malifaux is definitely going to feel a little bit more like that. The last thing in this one is maybe not so significant, but falling damage has been simplified. So basically, if you fall more than 2 inches, then you're just going to take a point of damage, which is a lot less punishing than what falling damage used to be like in 3rd edition. So if you are going to take some risks and jump up onto some high stuff, it's not going to be so punishing if somebody goes over and throws you off the roof. Now, those are all the reasons why using taller terrain and denser terrain is going to be a little bit easier, but that doesn't mean you have to use these different types of terrain. But the second point that I want to make here is that the schemes in 4th edition are actually going to straight up require that you use more vertical terrain. Now, obviously, schemes are going to change as the game ages, but the designers have stated that it was a particular design goal here to try to encourage the use of denser terrain boards with more verticality and get some cooler looking tables in the mix. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see the schemes change and still require some use of this verticality. So for example, in the set of schemes that we have available for the beta, there is a scheme called Take the High Ground. And Take the High Ground requires you to hold a certain number of pieces of terrain of height 2 or greater. Now, these pieces of terrain have to be not within 6 inches of your deployment zone, and to get your second point, you actually need one of them to be completely on the enemy's table half. Now, that doesn't sound that complicated, but in order for you to have any real choice in the situation, you're going to need a bunch of pieces of terrain that are height 2 or greater. If there's only 2 or 3 pieces available on the whole board, then some of those are going to be outright disqualified. And even if there are exactly the right number, it's really going to limit your choices, and your opponent's going to be able to stop you from scoring this scheme pretty easily. So it's going to be important that there's a bunch of variety out there so that you have some actual decisions to make. Because of the way that the schemes actually work in 4th edition, where it's this sort of choose your own adventure where the schemes are going to change every turn, you can't even set up a strategy and scheme pool that doesn't require height 2 terrain and then just build a board that's entirely flat and not have to worry about it. Because you may have a player who plays their schemes in such a way where they get to take the high ground and they want to use it, and if you've built the board in such a way that it's literally impossible to score that scheme, it's really not going to feel great as the player if that's a scheme that your crew is pretty good at doing. So that kind of means that every table that you set up, let's say at a tournament or any kind of event, you're going to have height 2 terrain available to be utilized by these players. Now, that's a reason why the rules are going to require more vertical terrain, but let's talk a little bit about the density of terrain in a game of Malifaux. In 3rd edition Malifaux, the boards tended to be about 1/4 to 1/3 covered in terrain. And that's pretty light by the standards of some war games where you'd see something like Infinity, where the entire table is completely covered in all these buildings and there's different layers and things like that. If you're enjoying this video and you want to support the channel, then there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. The first would be to pick up some merchandise through my merch store. You can grab a t-shirt, a hoodie, a mug, a sticker, all sorts of cool stuff like that. You can also shop using my affiliate links, so if you're going to make any purchases from any of these companies, you can use the links in the description below to make your purchases, and it will go directly to supporting the channel at no extra cost to you. There's also a link for my Ko-fi if you would just like to give me a tip, or my Patreon if you want to support me longer term. I have a bunch of different tiers there, and there are all sorts of benefits available to people, such as early access to videos, ad-free videos, the opportunity to vote in polls about upcoming content, and extra entries into the giveaways that I run occasionally. But if none of that is your cup of tea, no problem at all. Just make sure that you're subscribed to the channel and leave a like on the video. It actually helps a tremendous amount. And if you want to go the extra mile, then consider sharing the video out with some friends who you think might find it interesting. The YouTube algorithm is not kind to small YouTubers, so that helps a whole bunch. Other than that, consider joining the Discord, also linked in the description, where you can come and hang out with me and the rest of the community and talk games. But with that, let's get right back to the video. Now, in 4th edition, there's not really going to be any rules that require you to have a crazy density of terrain, but one of the things that's going to be really important, and that you may not have noticed when you were first reading through the rules when they got published with the beta, is that cover is actually going to apply to melee attacks now. And one of the things that is a big difference between 4th edition and 3rd edition is that defensive abilities are not nearly as effective, and even though your models are on average going to have more health, things die very quickly in this edition. But instead of cover just giving you a little bit of a defensive buff, what it's actually going to do is it's going to reduce incoming damage by 1. And what all of that means together is that you're really going to need to be able to take advantage of cover as a way to keep your models safe and not just getting blown off the board when your opponent sneezes on them. What that means is that it's going to be super important that we have enough terrain on the board that you're going to be able to take smart and tactical advantage of the cover that's available and not just be left out in the open like you would if you were playing in a 3rd edition board. So to kind of summarize everything that I just said, the new rules for 4th edition are going to allow you to really maneuver around a higher density of terrain as well as some more verticality on your tables for Malifaux. And the rules are also going to outright require in some cases, and also just kind of encourage you to have more terrain and higher terrain. Now, I've actually reviewed a bunch of different lines of terrain out there, and mostly I had Malifaux 3rd edition in mind when I was talking about those things, even though I talked a little bit about some other game systems. But I thought it would be good to just go through and highlight a couple of things that are going to be a little bit different now with 4th edition. So, for example, Weirdscapes is a line of terrain that Weird themselves actually does. And these are some extremely high quality plastic terrain kits that have like fully fleshed out interiors and all kinds of really fancy stuff to them. Now, they're really awesome, and they're definitely a premium product, but one of the interesting things about these is that the roofs on them actually make it so that you wouldn't be able to climb the buildings in this set of terrain. Now, the cool thing about them, though, is that you could just take those roofs off and use the buildings with their flat tops, and I think that actually works reasonably well. The roofs actually look interesting, and you can use them as separate pieces of blocking terrain. That's actually one of the examples that they used to show in the marketing for these sets. And frankly, a full set of Weirdscapes really isn't enough to fill out a table even in 3rd edition Malifaux. It would be a little bit light. So taking the roofs off and putting them elsewhere and kind of filling up more of the board wasn't a bad idea to begin with, but I think in 4th edition it's going to matter even more because you're going to want to be able to climb up onto those roofs for sure. One of the cool things is that a lot of them actually have these little platforms or walkways that go around them, so there was something that you could climb on anyway if you do decide that you want to leave the roofs on. But I think even with the roofs separate as pieces of blocking terrain, the full line of Weirdscapes is not enough to fill out a full board in 4th edition, because again, we're going to want more terrain on the board than we used to. Now, the cool thing is Weird has already teased that they are going to be developing a new line of terrain that is going to be specifically designed for 4th edition Malifaux, which is very exciting, and I'm really curious to see what that's going to look like. I love Malifaux-themed terrain stuff that's supposed to actually be from the universe, because there's so many cool and interesting things in the universe, and we don't really get to see a lot of that stuff. We kind of just have to use our imagination. So it would be really awesome to get a building for the Guild Enclave or Zoraida's Hut or something along those lines. And if it's going to take advantage of the new movement and terrain rules, then I think that's even better. I remember a couple of years ago, Weird actually put out a social media post asking people for recommendations for companies that make cardstock terrain. And it seemed like they were hinting at wanting to develop some sort of new product with some of the companies that are already out there. So I don't know if that's actually what they've done over the course of the last couple of years and if we're going to get some sort of cardstock terrain or if it's something else entirely or if they're going to be expanding on the Weirdscape set. I'm not sure, but it'll be super interesting to find out what's going on. The other really interesting thing to me is that if you look through the rules, there is actually a section for terrain cards, which is like a stat card that would go for specific pieces of terrain to define their characteristics. Now, this could be something as simple as just having a card available for something like a pyre marker, just as a quick reference so that maybe you can hand it to your opponent to show them exactly what a pyre marker's characteristics are without having to constantly reference back to your actual card. But I think this also really opens up the door for some more narrative style play in Malifaux, which I think is something that the game has been missing for a really long time. So let's imagine that Weird decides they want to put out a whole line of terrain that features a certain biome in Malifaux. Let's say they want to do the Badlands. They could have specific pieces of terrain that they sell that actually have characteristics in the game that are predefined. And so something like that might feel a little bit more thematic. They could actually have like an entire scenario built around these particular terrain pieces that they sell. So let's say there's some sort of strange anomaly in the Badlands that Obliteration has caused, which is something that they've sort of teased for the Onward expansion for Through the Breach. Maybe it has some particular characteristics to it, and they could sell a kit that allows you to play a whole kind of thematic encounter around those anomalies. I think that would be really awesome. There's definitely a handful of other companies out there who do similar things for their games, and I think it would be awesome to see something like that for Malifaux because it's such a cool world, and there's so many different interesting parts of the world that we really haven't explored that much yet. Now, being that Malifaux is such a varied world, there is really no limit to the type of terrain that you can use when you're putting together your tables for 4th edition Malifaux. I know a lot of people tend to have these sort of old-fashioned style buildings that have angled roofs, and unfortunately those aren't going to allow you to climb them, but I think you could still mix those in with some other stuff that does have flat tops that will allow you to climb up on top of them and have some that are climbable and some that aren't. Now, just to get an idea for the types of tables that we're looking at here, this is actually a vassal map that Weird has recommended that we use for 4th edition Malifaux because it has roughly the right mixture and density of terrain that they're looking for. And you'll definitely notice if you played a lot of 3rd edition that this is a little bit of a busy board by the standards of 3rd edition, but I think for 4th edition it makes a lot of sense. There's quite a bit of variety here of types of terrain, and there's a bunch of different pieces that have height of 2 or higher, although honestly I think maybe this is still a little bit light on the verticality because if you need to occupy pieces of terrain that are outside of 6 inches of your deployment zone, this is still going to be pretty limited in the number of choices that you have. Now, I decided to take some of my terrain and put it together to try to recreate this board in Meat Space, and I think I did a reasonably good job here. A lot of this stuff is not exactly the right size or exactly the right height for the map that we have on Vassal, but this is pretty close to what they're looking for, it seems like. And honestly, when you look at it like this, it doesn't actually seem that busy. I do think some of the stuff that I'm using is a little bit smaller than the stuff on the Vassal map, but even if you figured some of these buildings were a little bit bigger, this wouldn't be super duper busy by the standards of 3rd edition. So I definitely think that if you're playing casual games, you're going to want to bulk out your collection of terrain just a bit so that you can fill in some more of those spaces and definitely focus on some verticality on your boards. I think this is going to be the biggest problem for tournament organizers who are trying to put together 10 plus tables worth of terrain, and you may already have your system set up for the terrain that goes to each board, but now you're definitely going to want to add a little bit to that. I think this table is really cool, but honestly, I think we're probably going to want even more terrain than this in the long run. I don't know. I'm really curious what everybody else thinks. Get down in the comments below and let me know what you think of this table and what you think of the new rules and how that's going to affect the types of tables that you're designing. I definitely think this is the type of thing that is going to sort of evolve as the community gets used to the new rule sets, and we're going to see the terrain tables change as the edition grows older and we kind of get used to exactly what the ideal mix is. Funny enough, I actually recently put together an MNSU themed table with some sort of industrial terrain, which is something that you don't really see a lot in Malifaux. And I actually think it will work pretty well in 4th edition because it's got quite a bit of verticality with these little walkways and areas that you can climb up on top of. I'll probably try to bulk this out a little bit more and add a couple more places that you can climb up on top of. But there's one call out in the rulebook I wanted to bring attention to, and I think this table really illustrates it really effectively. The rulebook says that if you have big pieces of terrain, then it's a good idea to break them up into individual pieces and define them as separate pieces for the purposes of the rules. And if you look at this giant structure in the back of this table, I think this is a good example of something that needs to be divided up into individual pieces. Because while it's technically one piece of terrain, I think for the purposes of the rules, it should be divided up into 2 or maybe even 4. That's another thing we're going to have to get used to. We're going to have to remember to define those things and decide how it's all going to get broken down before we start the game so that there's no issues once the game starts. There's a bunch of things to think of when it comes to this type of stuff, and I have a bunch of different tables that I put together, and I'm going to be working on trying to optimize those a little bit more and getting some playtest games in so that I can see how they feel once I'm actually playing the game. Theory crafting only gets you so far, and in my experience, Malifaux is a game that will always surprise you, so I'm excited to see what ends up happening as far as the tables go. Now, you may have noticed that the mats that I'm using for my tables actually have my logo on them, and I'm excited to tell you that I have actually partnered up with Mats by Mars, who make my absolute favorite mats available for any wargame. I have a ton of their stuff for a variety of different systems, and a bunch of them are branded with my logo, so if you would like to get a mat with my logo on it, then you can go to Mats by Mars and use the offer code DefectiveDice. They do lined mats for 3rd edition Malifaux, which again is exactly the same as 4th edition Malifaux, so no worries there. And they also do mats for games like Infinity and Warhammer 40k and pretty much anything else you could possibly want. So be sure to go check out Mats by Mars. They make some really awesome stuff. That's all I got for you for now, but I want to hear from everybody else. What has been your experience with the new rule set, specifically as it concerns the terrain and things like objectives that require you to get up on top of buildings? How do you think that's going to affect the way that we build maps? And do you want to see some more heavy, dense maps like you might see in a game of Infinity? Or would you rather that Malifaux stays kind of similar to the way that it was in 3rd edition, where it's pretty light and you don't really need too much stuff to get a game going? I know that collecting terrain can be a little bit of a burden, and it also takes up a ton of room. I know that only too well. So it's definitely a concern that I think a lot of people have, but I'm wondering if there's going to be kind of a happy middle ground that will shake out as the game gets older. With that, I want to send a huge thank you to the Extremely Cool Kids tier on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatize, Spanner Rider, Dynat, Rob Younce, and Tom Likely. And thanks for watching.